library, to the South Orange Book Group, which plus normally the fourth Tuesday of the month is my book group that I've been running here for 25 years. And you're all welcome to come back next month when we don't have the author here, but it'll be great. Next, just one bit of information. Next month's book. Who has my book? Next month's book is The Last Kings of Shanghai. We have copies upstairs, or you can put yourself on the waiting list. But that's what we're going to be doing next month.
Just to let you know, there is an exhibit at the Jewish Museum on the Sasser.
Right, we're going to talk about that as well. So that'll be fun. But this month, we're so lucky to have Jessi Hempel, author of Family Outing, and my niece.
There was a pandemic and we had a couple of children.
I noticed you used it in the book too.
That's what I'm using from here on out.
So I've been in Jessi's family for 10 years, about 10 years, and she's got a wonderful family. So do I, but my family's sitting back there. And okay.
You should stand up though.
That's my husband. And my daughter disappeared. Oh, there she is back there. Enough of the family. Thank you all. So, surprise to me, I did not know you were working on this when you did when it came out, but you're a writer. You've done Wired, all kind of technical magazines stuff. Can I ask you why, how this memoir came out?
It's a reasonable question. I'm a business writer. I'm quite schooled in things like annual reports for financial companies. I'm very comfortable talking about technology and Facebook. And then there was the pandemic, and I emerged from the pandemic with this squishy book about my family, and it was very confusing for basically just about everybody that I knew. But to dial it back a second, I think this book came from a place that a lot of people will probably connect to. And so I'll go back to like March of 2020. So for me in March of 2020, I had sort of arrived in my career. I'd gotten to the place where I thought I wanted to be. I should say I worked for a long time with my former colleague Emily over there at Fortune magazine. I was a writer, and I got to write about important people doing important things in the world. And I had a sense that I knew who I was. I traveled a lot for work. It was kind of a sexy career. I had this like really wonderful wife, and we had this new baby. And then on a dime, we were just home. And the job was up in the air and in question, and we were nervous about getting sick. And we didn't have childcare, and I didn't even know if I was going to continue to have a job. And everything I thought that I understood about my identity was up for review. And what I remember most about Brooklyn, New York, which I'm guessing that somebody in this room probably lived in Brooklyn or New York, right? Was we lived on 7th Avenue in this ground floor apartment with like a basement that anywhere else would be a basement, but in Brooklyn is called a duplex. And there was the sound of the ambulances, right? But then when the ambulances would stop, there was no other sound. And so you would hear birds. And I remember the birds in 2020. And we got to that point where we were seeing on the news that Providence, Rhode Island was stopping New York license plates, and we thought, oh my goodness, maybe we should leave because things could get really dicey, and maybe we wouldn't be able to leave. And it's funny, I can't even relate to that moment now, but it felt so present at the time. And so my wife and I stuck our 15-month-old baby and our dog into the back of our Subaru because we are those kinds of stereotypical lesbians, and hit the gas and drove to her parents' house. And her parents lived in this small town in Tupelo, Mississippi. And if you had asked me at any other point in my life, do you think that as a middle-aged woman you'll move into your wife's childhood bedroom in Tupelo, Mississippi, I would have said no. But there I was. And at first I had a fun time Zoom yogaing and Zoom drinksing and doing all of the Zoom parties. But then after about a week of that, I was just done with it. And I was depressed, and I was lucky enough that my mother-in-law was watching our kid, but that actually just gave me big stretches of time. And during that time, I realized that the only people I was in contact with were my family, my mother and my father and my sister and my brother. And they lived in
Everywhere.
5 different houses in 4 different states, and we were in touch every day. And that was weird, because if you had known us 20 years before, you would have voted us least likely to ever talk to each other again. And I thought, well, gosh, like I wonder what this is about. And I thought, well, you know, I think it has something to do with the fact that we all came out about something. It was kind of going on in the back of my head. Because there's something about the experience of coming out where you are forced to grapple with yourself and come to terms with who you are, whether you want to or not. And if you go through that process, my reasoning was you are better able to have compassion for others and to be in relation with others. So that was kind of in my mind. And then I had this really commercial agent in New York, back in New York. And she was calling me on my cell phone. She'd call once a day. She'd be like, Jessi, I think you should publish a book. And I was like, Suzanne, have you seen my life right now? This is not a good time to write a book. And she's like, no, this is exactly the time, because back in New York, all of the publishers are scared. There's no deal flow. No one's selling books. All of the writers are at home somewhere. I don't know where. They're not trying to sell their books, so you have this window. So what do you want to write a book on? And I came back and I said, Suzanne, I want to write a business book about women in artificial intelligence. And she said, boring. Like, that is like sleepy. And I was like, okay, I want to.
I like that.
Right? I was like, I want to profile Mark Zuckerberg. And she's like, okay. And then finally she said, you know what, go back and come back to me. Don't overthink it. You've got 2 hours. I want you to come back to me in 2 hours with the thing you think you'll never be allowed to write. I'm going to sell that. And so I came back to her like 2 hours later and said, well, you know what, if I could do really anything, I would interview every member of my family and try to figure out why the hell we all came out of the closet at the same time and what it did for us. And like a week later, I had a book deal. And it was a factor of the moment in time and the crazy constraints that we were all under. And the way those constraints did this unexpected thing, which is they allowed for, I think, a creativity in me and an opportunity in the market for me to try my hand at doing something completely different. Which is a very long story, but that is how I got to the memoir.
A real quick little question. Did you have any hesitancy about going to Tupelo, Mississippi?
Heck yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know your family was there, but as a lesbian couple coming from Brooklyn, I would suspect you wouldn't be as welcome there as you are here. But
so we're a lesbian couple. We are also a heteronormative, white, privileged couple. We're ladies, not men. We have really cute kids. And Francis's grandfather had started the main store in town, in Tupelo, which is called Reed's. And I lay that all out because that's a heck of a lot of privilege. And what it means is that when we're in Tupelo, like, everybody has our back. We are those palatable people where people can be like, well, you know, I don't like gay people, but I like you. And like that is damaging in a million different ways, but it also left us feeling like we had a sense of responsibility if we could find a way to spend significant time in Tupelo to do that. Because there are lots of LGBTQIA+ people in Tupelo, and I'll tell you, and we can talk about the book in a second, but I will tell you, like, one of the things this book is unleashed in both my wife and I is like this desire to be more present in Tupelo for the queer community. Wow. Particularly right now because it is being hammered, right? And we are fast moving into like a binary world in which you either live in a place where it is okay to examine these issues or you live in a place where there is no longer any visibility. And so we go looking for any sort of resources. And we discover a Facebook page called the Tupelo LGBTQIA Center. And we think, well, that's cool. So we get in touch with the woman who runs it. And it turns out, actually, that's just Martha. And Martha is 70 years old. She has an oxygen tank. She works at the Toyota factory 70 miles up the road, which is an international company, which means that she has benefits for her wife, and she's not going to get fired for putting up a Facebook page. And if you're queer in Tupelo, you just know about Martha. There's not an internet, there's not a like resource page somewhere, you know because people talk and therefore you know. And Martha has rented a room at the Links Center, which is like a community center that is open on Saturday for 2 hours. And if you are a queer person, you just know how to find Martha to solve your problems. And the problems she solves are, I was caught cross-dressing and so my landlord has kicked me out and I need a place to live right away. I need hormones and I am a teenager and my parents can't know and there's no doctor in all of Mississippi who will prescribe them. Well, Martha knows the one telehealth doctor out of Chicago who will do it and look the other way at her age. Martha is just that person who knows. So
Amazing.
Francis and I were like, okay, we want to sponsor Martha. Like, what do you need? And so she's like, well, I don't know, you can't money, I don't know. And we're like, figure out how much a year's worth of your programming costs and come back and tell us. We'd really like to help you. And she did, and she came back and she said, it cost me $375. Which is just also like a window into the different resources that people have and how much smart money can do in places like Tupelo.
And we all live here in Maplewood, South Orange, Brooklyn. We have a different worldview unless we try to see another way, just as in Mississippi, Tennessee, wherever. So I didn't know about Martha until now. That was fascinating.
You said it was a short question, I'm sorry.
No. So what I did want to know is, okay, so you decided to do this book.
Mm-hmm.
You obviously need buy-in from your siblings and your parents. How did that go?
Well, you know my sister, so that's kind of awkward.
I spoke to her last night and I reminded her, she said, have a good time. Okay.
So, as a journalist, I understood better than my other family members, the weight of exposing one's self, right? And so it was important to me that everybody felt like it was their decision to participate. My mom was the first to sign on. She was like, that's a great idea. If you think that is a thing that is going to help you make peace of your childhood, I don't exactly know what happened in your childhood, but you sure seem angry about it, and if this is going to help, great. My dad was like, well, that's a great idea. You're probably going to need a lot of material on me. I'll start to get it ready. I'll set aside a lot of time. Later, his feedback was, this is great, but I think you can use another chapter or two on me. My brother and I had done a piece together for Time magazine, so he was the one who had some sense of what we would be doing, and he was really excited to do it. My sister took the longest time to come around, and I think it's because my sister understood that she wasn't just letting me tell her story. She was letting me tell my version of her story, which is a lot for any little sister to give to her big sister. And I think, so I did two things that were not things that my editor recommended, right? The first was my editor was like, you write the whole book, you give it to them, you give them 2 weeks turnaround, and then you just publish. And I thought, this is going to be so personal. And I always knew that I was going to make it really personal. And so I needed to give everybody buy-in as I went. So every time I would write, every third chapter, I would just give over 3 chapters as we went. So everybody at every step got all the material and got opportunity to weigh in, and at the same time, nobody else did. So unlike anything I've ever written, apart from my family and my editor, nobody read this pre-publication.
Did they make changes or make?
Well, my mother, upon reading it, was like, now I know why you're angry. Also, I thought you had a happy childhood. And that was actually the hardest, right? Because my mom, and my mom in some ways is a woman who had her own mental health crisis. If you got through the book, you know that she had a suicidal period that coincided with our early adulthood. And in the run-up to that suicidal period, she was depressed for a lot of years. And that was hard for her children. And when she was finally better, we were so happy she was better that we never in those moments leveled with her about what that experience was like for the 3 of us. So here she is now, as a woman in her early 70s, having these conversations for the first time. And of course, having the conversation with me opened it up with my poor, long-suffering sister and brother, who were just like, why did you decide to write a story about our family? And that was hard.
Yeah.
But in the end, it was kind of freeing. It was really, and now my mom really likes the book.
Really?
Yeah, she's psyched about it. Yeah.
Was there a reason that you didn't put their pictures in the book? I was looking, though I know what everybody looks like, obviously. Normally when I read a memoir biography, there's, an insert in the center with, formative pictures and going on. And this one didn't. Neither does Spare, by the way. Harry's new book doesn't have pictures either. But was there a reason that you decided not to do it? Was it conscious or?
I felt like I wanted to allow readers the privilege of attaching their own images to the characters. You know, whenever you write something and you let it out into the world, like the resulting text is not just like a reflection of me, but it's a reflection of me and also what the reader brings to it. And that marriage is important, and I wanted to give the reader the space to bring to it what they wanted to bring to it. And then also, you know, particularly for my brother, who is transgender, half of this book occurred before his transition. And I struggled with the text, and images would have made it more difficult to figure out how to handle that respectfully. And in truth, there was no struggle. Like, I was pretty clear about what that meant, which is that I would never want to include a photograph of my brother before the transition. That would be like spitting in his eye. And also that for people who don't have a close tie to the transgender community, that is also really confusing. And it's fair that that is confusing. I also wanted this book to be a place where you could bring what you didn't know and feel comforted in the fact that you didn't have to know it in order to sort of understand the story.
I get it. I still wanted pictures, but I
I can hook you up.
Yeah, I've seen a few.
I Googled it. I Googled it later on. I everybody but your mom.
Mm-hmm. So my mom, right before the book came out, called me up, and she was so angry that I had included one part where she hit me. And here's the truth, like, she hit me more than once. She was like violent in our youth, and it was mostly aimed for me. And I was very aware of the fact that in our culture you need to say so little about a mother, a woman and a mother, for us to all judge her, right? And so I needed to share so little about my mother's behavior. And I knew that even in sharing the littlest bit of it, there would be such judgment around it. And so I had treated it with such kid gloves. And yet her perception of it was, how could you do this to me? And that was the hardest moment for me in the whole book process. Because I realized that actually I'd been carrying that around my entire adulthood, the dichotomy between, I know this happened, and I love you and want to take care of you. And figuring out how to have those two truths exist together was really challenging. And this was the moment where I had to make space for them. And so she said, look, if you're going to include that, then at least change my name. And I was like, Mom, this nice woman over here is going to Google and learn that you've changed your name. And
I couldn't find a picture.
yeah, but I'll do that. And so I used her middle name, Anne. And I knew this would happen, and then it exactly happened, which is that the book came out, and all of her friends read it, and they all loved it. And she called me up and she said, you can change my name back now. And I said, no, I can't. The book's out.
You brought up your mother, even at the end of the book, you brought up about your mother's kind of was still evolving in her comfort level.
Yeah.
So I got that. You know, okay, that's why I can't find her, because she's not totally, she's comfortable but not totally comfortable yet.
Right, and also my mother drew the shit straw in the late half of the 20th century to be a woman and to be straight and to be married to a gay man. Like, everybody knew what to do for my father, including my father. Which isn't to say that his life was easy, by the way, right? It's just that it's a more known path. Like, you come out, my dad came out and he joined the gay bike riders, and he joined the gay church, and he joined the queer theater group, and all of a sudden he had a million friends, and a million birthday parties, and a million communities to come out into. And my mother was left to figure out how to reconstitute her identity when she never wanted to leave the life that was taken away from her in the first place. And that is not a story that's about my mother, I think, as much as a story that is about one iteration of what womanhood looked like in the late half of the 20th century. And it's unresolved for me, and so I didn't want to resolve it for readers.
Speaking of your mother, the book is called The Family Outing. And I said, how are we going to work on Pat? What did she come out to or from? I understand the siblings and your dad, and we talk that queer as, you come out. But everybody seems to come out in their own way in your book. And I think that's what you were trying to get at?
Yeah. I mean, I ultimately thought I think about coming out as not, it's something that,
is it always sexual? I mean, no.
No, the queer community, we have taken that word, and that word has served us very well. But I think of coming out more as something that all of us do many, many, many times as we allow our identity to change, right? You're born into a body, you're born into a world, your parents look at you on the day that you're born, whoever they are, and they have expectations for who you will become. I have saddled my dear son and daughter with expectations for who I expect them to become. And then you grow for a while in the world, and inevitably, those expectations don't meet you where you're at. And the work that you have to do as a human is to bridge the gap, to go from what is expected of you to who you authentically are in the world. And that is what I think of as coming out. And so for my mom, the biggest way in which she came out was dealing with the trauma of the crimes that happened to her in her childhood and happened around her in her childhood.
Did she bury those memories? I mean,
Completely.
Completely.
Mm-hmm.
And
They just surfaced.
they do. Speaking of your children, what is going to be their coming out? Are they, when they read this book and they read about their family and their teenagers, what's your expectation of what they will become? Or you have no idea?
I mean, can anybody credibly tell me that they can predict what their children will do, right? Like, I suspect that my children will think that I have a very narrow view of what it means to live authentically. That however society will progress, it will do so in a way where when they come to this conversation, they will look down on the language that I used, look down on the narrow way in which I thought of my own identity, whatever that is, and expect something different for themselves. And I guess also this is what I hope for them. You know, I also hope that neither of them is a writer.
Don't worry, you'll
For
find ways
obvious
to do
reasons.
You know, because I'm thinking of the 6 cousins.
Yeah.
There are 6 of them, like within 5 years. I
Yeah.
mean, everybody, you all have babies at the same time. And when they look at their family in 2040, whatever it is,
Yeah.
you know, how are they going to relate to that? As their family, I guess.
Well, I hope that they have a sense that they know what drove some of our decisions and that will stand them well in terms of character. Also,
They're absolutely all adorable, by the way. They're just so cute.
biased, but also it was no accident that this book came out exactly in this moment. It couldn't have come out later. It couldn't have come out earlier. Because they're all so young that it will be a decade. This book will live in the world for long enough that I felt confident that it wouldn't be harmful to them by the time that they read it. So.
Can you say more about what you said about they'll think that you had a narrow view of the world? I don't understand that at all. What do you mean by that?
So I look back on my parents and I think, well, because of history and culture and time, they lived in a box compared to how I think about what is available to me in terms of tools for how to explore my identity. Like my father was a gay man who never had the language for that or had that modeled or had any like ability to walk into that identity until he was 40. And so in some ways I got to have so much more of an opportunity to explore who I was, right? And I think that my children will similarly spin forward and have more opportunities to explore who they are because culture is changing so much right now. And culture is changing so much right now. I think, you know, speaking specifically about sexuality and gender identity, I look at young people like going through these teenage years right now. And as the author of a book called The Family Outing, I've actually been asked by people who think I should know something about, like, what do you make of all of these young people coming out around sexual orientation and gender identity? And the truth is that, like, I'm proficient at it because I studied it in the same way that I'm proficient at French because I have studied it. But I'm not fluent in it and I never will be. Like, this is the next revolution. And I know enough to know it's a revolution. I should stand back and watch and respect. But I don't know enough to claim it as my revolution. And my children will be part of whatever follows that. They're little. There will be another decade before they're asking these questions and thinking about their identity this way. Yes, please.
And I think to just answer your question, I think all of our kids look at us as having a narrow perspective. Regardless of who we are, what we've done, what we've accomplished in life, they'll look at us as having a narrow perspective because their perspective will be broader than ours in some way, shape, or form, as the world changes and evolves.
In addition, we think we're broader. You know, they think that we're narrow, but we think that we're with it,
Well, we think we know that.
understanding.
Yes, yes.
So there's two sides to that coin.
Exactly.
But then they'll get even older and they'll realize you're a product of your time.
Exactly.
You know, you just have to keep living, you know?
If you live long enough.
Yes.
Yes, is there, Dorothy, what do you?
Have you been contacted by anybody else who said, I thought that I was unique, my family's like yours, or?
Yes, so many people. Oh my gosh, so many people.
And the other thing, have you thought about genetics, since that they can sequence the family's genome and figure out, maybe answer some questions?
You know, as part of the reporting for the book, because I am a reporter at the end of the day, I can't help myself, I went looking for academics who studied the genetic theories around sexuality. And the best I could come up with is that there are many incremental ways in which it's possible that sexuality, sexual orientation is genetically passed on. But there is not one gay gene. And there are just as many incremental ways in which it is socially passed on. And so there is not a way, either inside the family where we all talk about this and kind of make fun of it and have fun with it, or externally where our community is under attack. There's kind of not a way to know whether it is genetically passed on. And I know from my own family that, like, I know my own experience is that by the time I was 7, I was like, something's different about me, and that I don't think that I could live my life another way. But I also know that I believe, my sister's not here to talk for herself, but I think that she could very well, had she not had the exposure and understood this as a path forward for her, she could have lived another variation of life very happily.
Has your book been banned yet?
There was a
How do
library
we
in
know about
Arkansas.
doing that?
Like in Texas, or is it?
There's a library in Little Rock that forcibly removed it, and there was a woman who got very upset about that and enrolled me in the process of getting them to reinstitute it.
Oh, wow.
And that is in process. There are many libraries that chose not to buy it because of that. And libraries are some of your more important buyers when you have a book go to market, so it probably impacted how well the book did in its first month in market. There are other libraries that chose to buy it because of that, though. So.
Several copies. Do you have a favorite part? I should have asked you before, but do you have a favorite part of the book that you would like to read to us?
Oh gosh.
No? Okay.
Do you have a favorite part of the book?
Of course.
Okay, my favorite part is actually, first of all, the dedication Jessi wrote to me, thanks for being such an advocate of my writing and of our family. Love, Jessi. She love. But my favorite part is for Felix, Alexandra, Jude, Sebastian, August, and Alice Camille, which are all the children. And I think that's like the best dedication for this, because this is for the future, and this is for them when they get older, even though they will think that you're square. I did, when I opened the book and read that, it actually brought tears to my eyes, so thank you for that. Are there any questions? Just, would you mind answering some questions?
I would love to, yeah.
Hi.
Did your mother consider that she was coming out as straight when everybody else was coming out as something else?
I considered that. My mother didn't have the language around that. It's funny also, you know, in some ways, I think every family is like this, right? Like, I feel like my dad, and I feel like my brother. We're all three of us are just word people. We kind of understand the world in the same way. We laugh at the same jokes. We have a shorthand that I don't know why we have, right? And my mother and my sister are like that. And they are not word people. They are image people. They're really image driven. They're both very, very artistic. My sister's very athletic. And it really made it challenging to figure out how to tell this story because so much of the story relied on me interviewing people. So I'd interview my brother and my dad, and they would talk on at length and get these volumes of story. And my mother and my sister, it was much more like pulling, not because they were reticent to participate, but because they understand the world so differently than I do, that I couldn't land in the same place with them. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's funny because you said that your mother buried her exposure to the killer.
Yeah.
And I have a sister-in-law who's from the same area, and I was talking to her just 2 weeks ago, and she, at first, when I'm talking about it, couldn't remember anything about it, but by the end of the conversation, oh yeah,
So she had also buried it.
yeah. And
You know-
the same age, kind of.
It's interesting, you know, the reason why I wanted to, it's very, very challenging to figure out how to write about a serial killer in a book that's not about a serial killer, because you know what everyone wants to talk about is a serial killer, and especially to start the book that way. But the thing that I really wanted to highlight, which I don't know if this applies to your friend, was the way in which young women at that time, like at least my mother, felt responsible for her own safety. Like she should be able to prevent bad things from happening to her. But we all know that you can't actually do that. You can do all the right things, but bad things still happen to people. And that's the truth that we are willing to grapple with in many ways in our culture right now. For one, we have mental health care that will support us through it. And my grandparents loved my mother very, very much, just as much as I love my son, probably more. And what love looked like in 1969 when this happened, in 1972, was them saying, okay, let's never talk about this. This is embarrassing, I never want you to have to think about it, we're just gonna move on. And I kind of imagine that probably was the case for many young women at that time.
When I'm at your mom's age, and I was living in Queens during Son of Sam. And it was the same thing, all the girls that were taken looked like me. None of us went out. I mean, that was
Yeah.
how we kept ourselves
Yeah.
safe. We stayed home, because I didn't think I would be, strong enough to face it. So I stayed home. But your mom, on the other hand, was out.
But she was following all the rules,
Right,
right? Like
that's
she
what
was
I'm saying.
home by 9 o'clock. She was in, like, this guy that ended up being, if you haven't read the book yet, like, and I don't say this directly in the book because the lawyers wouldn't let me, but like, this guy was understood to, it was two men working in tandem, and he got off by testifying against his friend. And that guy ended up being my mother's boyfriend for a little while. And she met him at work, and it was a like totally reasonable relationship and a reasonable romance. She didn't ever make a decision that I wouldn't make, and that is what is, I think, scary about it. And I should say that like one of the coolest parts about this whole process was early on I like went down the rabbit hole learning all about the Ypsilanti Slayer, and I found this guy who had grown up in the town at the same time, who was a retired like high school teacher living in California. And he had, during his retirement, done his own amateur investigation and written his own self-published book. So I called him up and I was like, where is this guy? Like, just where is he? And he said, oh, he's dead. And I was like, what? And so the man sent me Arnie's obituary, and I was able to give it to my mom and say, hey, Mom, this guy's dead. He's never coming for you. And what that did for my mom was like so relief. You know, it was really cool.
So when you started to write the book, was it just to write about your family? Or deep down, was it to bring the family together like it did?
I thought I was going to write one narrative about my family, and that would bring my family together. And I discovered there is no such thing as one narrative about a family, because nobody remembers anything, even when they try. And you'll be like, no, that dinner happened in 1982, and I'll be like, it never happened at all. And it's like hopeless. But if you're lucky, what you can get to is a general sense of the emotional truth of a family that everybody can agree on. And that's where we landed.
I'm going to ask a question first. Did anybody agree to be talked about in the book, but you couldn't use their name? Was there anybody who was hesitant to be referred to?
No, I will say that I have, I would say, an abnormally large list of ex-girlfriends on account of it took me a while to get it right. And without asking any of them, I gave them all pseudonyms.
Oh, you did.
But the thing about writing about other people in the book generally was that what I was really exploring was always the emotional geography of our own family and at the end of the day, emotional geography of me. And so I'd like to think that I didn't sell anybody out, pseudonym or no pseudonym. That, that was at least my goal.
You could ask her later.
No, I think it's relevant.
Suzanne.
I have a sideline about the Ypsilanti killer. I'm very curious about that. No, but as you were giving your family say every few chapters of what was included, was there something they wanted you to strike that you felt strongly should be in there? And how did you have that conversation?
The part where my mom wanted me to, that was a great question, the part where my mom wanted me to take out the fact that she had hit me with the tote rack was really difficult. I lost a lot of sleep over whether to include it. Wasn't an easy decision. Talked about that a bit. The other thing that was like a little bit is that I think when I started this book, everybody had their own agenda for it. And so my mom was like, great that you're writing this book. People will finally understand what an asshole your dad was. And like, when I didn't dial that up enough for her, she was pretty like obsessed about that. And my dad was like, this is great that you're writing the book because people are finally going to understand what a great guy I am. And so yeah, we had some material there. And my brother and my sister, you know, that funny thing about that year was that all three of us had new babies. The second generation of our family happened within 9 months, all three of us. And so my poor brother and sister were like, yeah, you can write this book. I will talk to you in the middle of the night when I'm breastfeeding. You can record it, but like, I don't got time to read this. And you know, like, so I don't think they ever read most of what I give them.
I was really struck by when you were talking about the interview process, how you started off on FaceTime and then you moved to the phone because you felt like you could really listen more. And I just thought that, I just wondered how you came to that. Like, did you, in the moment, realize that you weren't really receiving?
It was so exhausting to look.
Right, yeah.
And the exhaustion would take it sort of out of the moment. And then I think I had a problem with connection once with my dad and was like, oh, this feels so different on the phone. But then the other side of it is, like, I do have, early on, all of these Zoom calls recorded. And that does mean that at some point in the future, my kids will be able to see me talking to my parents, at least a little bit. I really like that. But for the sake of the project and where it caused us to go that we wouldn't have otherwise, talking on the phone was much better.
How long did the project take from beginning to publication? I mean, we want to talk a little bit about making a memoir. It's Makers Month, it's Women's History Month. I'm supposed to bring all those topics into this conversation. So how long did it take you to make this, once you decided to do it?
I sold it, I signed the contract in July of 2020. I turned in a finished copy on November 1st of 2021.
So a little over a year.
And that was considered extremely speedy
Yeah.
for HarperCollins. They were like, my agent sort of baked in 6 months for me to just miss. But then because I'm a journalist, I didn't know that. Because journalists are like, you don't miss your deadlines because you can't, you'll get fired. And so I turned it in on the day, like, it was weird first because, like, I'm talking to my agent every day. I mean, she called me. And then we came up with the book, and then we talked to these editors, and then we sold the book, and then it was sold, and the next day I called her up, and she was like, why are you calling? And I was like, Suzanne, we talk every day, it's me. And she was like, I know, go write your book. So then I called the editor up who had bought it, this great guy named Rakesh Satchal, who's very talented and was a gay queer man, and those things were a queer man and a person of color who had also written a memoir. Those things were all really important to me. And so I called him up, and he was like, oh, why are you calling? And I was like, well, you know, you bought this book, and what are we going to do? And he's like, there's no we here. You're going to write the book, and then you give it to me, and if you run into trouble, you call me, and I will get you out of trouble. And I panicked. I totally panicked. I was like, I just...
It's all in your life.
I got to figure out how to write 300 pages quick. Yeah.
I felt sorry for your mother, by the way, because I thought there was, all the siblings and your dad, you had this commonness of coming out. Your mother didn't even know that there was a coming out to come, you know, so I really felt sorry. I still do, because, and she's my vintage, I think, and we knew nothing about anything, all right? We were just talking about that, or I didn't know anything about anything, So it was really an eye-opener, I think, for your mom and a lot to deal with. Plus your dad, even though he didn't come out, he was showing who he was by his behavior and closing in.
Yeah.
And so she didn't know why, in my opinion, things were falling apart.
Yeah.
It was because it wasn't working for him. So I really felt sorry for her. She was really the outsider in the whole thing.
Yeah.
So you can tell her that, I don't know if I think your dad's a jerk, but that I get that she didn't get it, you know, and everything that followed because of her not getting it, like, she was hit by the side of the head. on
You know,
this
my
whole
mother-in-law was really helpful. I have the best in-laws, this couple in Tupelo, Mississippi, and my mother-in-law's divorced. Her husband left her when my wife was about the same age that I was when my parents split. And she has a very happy, realized life. It's very different than my mother's life. She is remarried, she's got a big blended family, and she is like really realized in her life. And she's very kind and she's very soft-spoken. She never says critical things ever. And I was struggling with this while we were in their house because we just lived with them forever during the pandemic. And she said, I am telling you that you don't know what the experience of divorce is like, and you don't know what being my age is like, and you need to cut your mom more slack than you are cutting her. And it changed the way that I wrote about my mom. And I still don't know that I did a good job, huh?
I thought you wrote about her with a lot of compassion.
You didn't read the
considering
first
how
draft.
you know, in the beginning you're angry, but in
Yeah.
the end I thought you were very kind about her because you could have stayed in that angry place, but you wrote about her, like, you seemed to get it, like, yeah, it must suck to be blindsided in such a horrendous way, like, 20 years of your life, just poof, like, you felt like were a lie, but they're not, but, you know, that's how you feel, like, you've
Right.
just been lied to for 20 years, so
Right.
of course you're gonna be angry
Right.
and unpleasant. So I thought you were very nice about it, and
Thank
wrote about
you.
it with a lot of compassion in the end of the book.
Do you think she really didn't know? Do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I do. I
I
don't
didn't
ever
read the
doubt that.
books,
I
I'm
don't
sorry.
ever doubt that.
Mm.
I think my dad didn't know.
Mhm.
You know, we are really good at deceiving ourselves.
Mhm.
It's not like he didn't know some things, but he had just sort of a binary split, and he was like, there's good Paul and there's bad Paul, and bad Paul is someone nobody else can ever see in the world, or else like God will strike me dead. And so I'm not even going to let myself know about bad Paul, and I'm going to try to be good Paul.
But I think I tell your mother, oh, there's someone in the audience who thought he is a jerk, he is an asshole. because he said, well, I kind of thought I was gay at one point. What did you do about it? I married your mother.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I know there was a different support system then, but that was such a disservice
Yeah.
to her.
Yeah. And I think that's really, really fair, and also I think, like, where I landed with my mother is that she gets to have her anger. Like, at the end of the book, I ended up sort of just giving her the space to just have her anger, and I so wanted the book to have just a happy ending. I wanted it to be clean. I wanted my family to have a happy ending, and if I could just write the happy ending in the book, then I'm sure we can land it with the family. And where I came
But I
to
don't know
was,
how many
like,
families actually have happy
yes,
endings.
that is, I unfortunately had to write a book to learn that, but yeah, that is sort of where I came to. Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting that you started with your mother and the whole thing around the, what happened in Michigan, which I recall that. And, the trauma of it, because when you really have to admit this happened, instead of, putting it in the closet, she did. I mean, I think in that sense, all 5 of you came out. And she wasn't alone. She was like secrets, a dark thing. I think about these children that have witnessed these murders. And they are going to be scared to go to school, they're scared, whatever. There's just so much craziness and so much lack of mental health. I mean, you say we have mental health, care. Well, if you have health care at all, which a third of us aren't seeming to have, I think they're saying. And I just wonder, like, how are people going to get through? Little children, that see something like that. Their world forever is not safe.
Yeah. I wish I had anything at all to say to that.
Oh, I'm not even asking. But I'm just saying, I appreciate it. I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah, and that is something also that, it happened in Nashville, Tennessee. The shooter was a transgender person. Watching the media try to bumble around how to cover that. The national media, the New York Times and NPR has actually done a pretty good job, but the local media is what we read, and they're just bumbling along. And you can quickly see how the right is going to try to distract us from the real issue at hand by once again focusing on their.
That Marjorie Taylor, whatever her name was, has been suspended from Twitter for a week, which is ridiculous, I don't even know. They did that because of the horrendous things that she's been posting. So this was their perfect, they think it's their perfect way in to say all these terrible things. But we as a community, as allies, as queer, what do we do to support this community, your community, the gay community? What can we do? South Orange and Maplewood is a bubble. I mean, we live here and everything is almost okay. But I don't want to go to Florida. I don't want to go to Texas.
I don't want to go anywhere else.
Yeah.
I'm okay here. That's good.
So that is totally true, and also I think that we need to hold all of the multiple truths of our moment, right? And it is really, really difficult to let optimism go in the face of what we are experiencing right now. But this book is also a reminder of the fact that when I graduated from college, I really thought children were off the table for me, and I never thought that marriage was a possibility for me. And by the time I hit middle age, I am a woman whose name is on the birth certificate of both of my children, despite the fact that I'm not genetically connected to them, and whose marriage is protected by law. And that is an astounding amount of change for 2 decades. And things go this way and things go that way. And our challenge as humans is not to only look at the positive or to only look at the negative, but to hold the space for great change. And then in the space for great change, to lean toward the optimistic.
But somebody's going to take it away from you.
What?
The Supreme Court wants to take it away from you.
Oh yeah. I'm not saying that that's not true. I'm saying that this moment right now is a special moment.
Tracy?
I have a question about the way in which you actually reference your research. You reference it as the project. And in my heart, I felt like it should have been or could have been referred to as our life story. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And did you use that terminology to make it easier for your family to participate? Because as a project versus our life story or our memoir, our family history, that kind of thing?
It's a great question. I mean, that a bit came out of like a writing conceit. I don't know if there are any other writers in the house, but so much of what this book stretched me on was the mechanics. I wanted to figure out how to tell 5 people's narratives at the same time and not confuse you and abandon you as a reader. And so coming up with this common thing we were all doing together gave us a reference point in the contemporary moment that allowed me to sort of go back and forth a bit without confusing you. And life story was of course what we were doing, but project just felt a little bit more packaged. I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but.
Dorothy?
I have a question about Evan. So, in the beginning, you didn't really talk about Evan until much later, but you always refer to him as Evan. We know he was born a girl, but female, but you called him Evan. Did the whole family call him Evan? Acknowledged, Sophie, Mom, your dad, everybody called him Evan.
Yeah.
And what clothes did he wear when he was?
As a child?
Yeah.
Well, up until the point that he came out to us as Evan, which is when he was 24, he went by the name that he had been given at birth.
Oh, because I got the feeling that he wanted to be called Evan right from the start. So that's something I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Well, the confusing thing in my book, but also in life, is what do we do when we all share a family history and we all share a family narrative and we all hold on to our different memories of people? And I am very clear that what it means to center my brother's experience is to refer to him as my brother because that's what he asks to be called. But then how do I also make room for my experience? Because growing up for me meant having 2 little sisters. That's how I experienced my childhood. Or my parents' experience. Like, parents go through so much loss when a child comes out as trans, and there isn't a good way to channel that loss into something that they feel like they're allowed to touch, because they're so focused on getting to the place where they're centering their child's experience as trans. but that is a loss for you too. And so I was looking for a way, and I think it was kind of imperfect, to tell the reader, like, you know, right at the beginning of the story, like, yeah, you know and I know that this person was understood to be a girl for the first half of this book. And let me tell you right now as the narrator, I'm going to call him a boy. That's what I was trying to do.
That wedding,
Yeah.
were you also uncomfortable in that his wedding?
Yeah.
Like, wow, I was like, oh my God. I just can imagine sitting there in that wedding because it was such a, I don't know, everything, and everybody seemed to be like that.
The article you wrote for Time magazine on Evan when he had Jude, not Jude, when he had a son, did that get a lot of response from the community, from all different areas of the community? What happened with that article? Did it inspire you to do this book?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly did. It was Time magazine's most read article of the year.
Serious?
I would like to think it was because of the words, but also a very gifted photographer took a picture of my brother chest feeding his child. That is an astounding and very moving photograph. And it could be that the photograph told the story, just saying. But yeah, the response to that story was pretty wonderful because I heard from a lot of transgender parents who said, I felt like this story did an accurate job of portraying my experience. And that was very important to me. The interesting thing about the trans community at that point in 2016, which is I think even different in 2023, is that there was this age divide. And if you were older than 40 at that point, the idea of somebody wanting to have children felt very threatening because you had fought so hard for the binary distinction of holding on to your gender that you didn't really understand why somebody could want to be a man and also do this thing which seemed like the epitome of womanhood, and B, it felt threatening to you. So I had a group of transgender readers who felt like the story was bad for the cause.
What about
I think that's different even 8 years
the
later.
hormones, like, I'm worried about the hormones, the taking them, not taking them, taking them, not taking them, you know, for him,
Yeah.
health-wise, like, is
For
he-
my brother in particular, you mean?
Yeah, no, for him in particular, yeah, because of the risk of switching off like that, like what?
Yeah. And the fact that he did it for a long time without medical supervision is
He
like,
figured it out himself,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You did a spectacular job of honoring your brother as who he was his whole life by calling him Evan always, and by letting it be understood that he was who he was and that had nothing to do with the stuff he was born with on his body.
Well, thank you for saying that so much. And also, an unexpected thing happened, which is that when I started to write all the stories that I tell, that Nancy probably heard before, but just write about them with the gender he chose, I also understood him for the first time. I'd like reflect back on my brother at 5.5 when he left his underwear in the bathroom because he'd peed in them and like he'd taken one leg out and so he like hooked up his Oshkosh and then they fell out in the school and I always thought, oh God, my little sister is like such a dweeb, right? She like never fits in. But then as I begin to like think about this person embodied as who he always told me he was, a little brother, I started to be like, oh yeah, he really did never fit in. Look how he didn't fit in there. He's always been like his own little person. It was like I could finally understand him. And it was like, oh, I wish I had just known how to do this in the first place.
Right? One last question, okay, because then we have to be out of here in 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Has anyone approached you to sell the movie rights?
Yes, there is a wonderful woman named Sarah Jacobson-Borsch who made the movie. She was the executive producer on a movie called Coda that you can see on Apple TV that won the Academy. And she has optioned it, which does not mean that it will be a movie, ladies and gentlemen. It just means that somebody is interested in it, which was like, I had a lot of interest in it. And a lot of people who were like, I'm going to pay you this much, and maybe we'll make it into a series, and you don't mind if we set it in Tupelo, Mississippi, because that story you told about Mississippi at lunch, that was kind of cool. And then there was this one woman who's this French, like, indie filmmaker. Coda was her first big film. It did really, really well, but she only has done one. But she loves it and she gets it, and I don't really care if it becomes a movie, but I do care that an artist I respect is working on it. So if you ever do see it, it will be something that I love.
That's exciting, I didn't know that, that's great. Last question, what's next for you? Another book?
I
Or
think
article?
definitely another book. I really want to write a
Women in A.
Women in
I really want to write a book about career and work and business and tech. Like, I love that stuff. I didn't stop loving that stuff because I loved this project. So that's probably where I go.
We'll have you back and we'll talk about ChatGPT and all that other good stuff.
I just want to say, like, thank you for putting the time into reading this. It is a great joy and a privilege for me to get to talk with people who engaged in the work deeply. That happens so much less frequently than one would think of authors, and it just means a lot to me. So
Thank you.